Okay, so I have tried 3 or 4 different times now to make this video. Someone recently had uh, said maybe it would help if I were to make a video explaining some of the changes that I have experienced through the process of initiation. If you've ever watched my videos or gotten a reading from me, you've heard me talk a lot about magic and the concept of magical initiation, a book called Kabbalah Magick and the GreatWork of Self-Transformation, the Golden Dawn, all that kind of stuff. And so, um, trying to talk about the changes that I have experienced through this tends to turn into a bit of an unfocused rant with a lot of tangents and it gets kind of convoluted. And I'm starting to think it kind of has to be that way because there's kind of a gap between the logic that we're all sort of trained and conditioned to use to understand the world around us and the tree of logic that grows from a magical practice. There's a gap between the two. And when you try to bridge that gap, things get very complicated and weird and convoluted and sometimes paradoxical. And you can only use metaphors and analogies and you kind of end up talking in circles in ways because we're trying to use a method of understanding the world to understand a thing that completely defies the ability to do that with that type of thinking. Say already we're getting a little kind of convoluted and confusing. So when I say a tree of logic, people always talk about rational thoughts, being a logical person. But very rarely do you hear anybody actually talk about what that really fundamentally means. We all kind of just take for granted that it means a certain thing and never think to really question it too deeply. And so any logical process, logic being, this happens and causes this, and therefore that happens, and this comes, and it's like a linear progression of events, like a causal chain of cause and effect. But at the foundation of that line of thinking is a mystery, which means you kind of have to make an assumption because that mystery, and even if you talk to the most hard nosed scientist there is, they'll tell you that what is consciousness? Don't really know. And you can talk about the effects that it has. You can say this part of the brain lights up when you do this, but then you say, well, where do those electrical impulses come from? I don't know. Or you look at images describing the Big Bang, and it's like you see it's like a guy blowing up a balloon with pennies on it. If you've ever seen that diagram to describe how the expansion of the universe, but then you ask, well, who's the guy blowing up the balloon? I don't know. Don't ask us to explain that. So at the core of it, and since let's go back a little bit, because every single thing that you experience and do and think in your life begins with consciousness. If you didn't have consciousness, you wouldn't even have the ability to question what is consciousness. So everything comes down to consciousness, right? But we don't really know what that is, where it comes from, exactly how it works. So you kind of have to make your best guess and then go from there. But in our modern manifestation of society, we've kind of glossed over the fact that it's all based on a guess, and we all take it for granted as absolute fact because this progression of thinking leads to things like computers and TVs and cell phones and rockets and electricity and all that kind of stuff. And that all works, it's obviously has some merit to it. It's very good at dealing with material things, material science. Which material science, at its very core, fundamentally, actually did begin with have a mystical experience. We'll get into that later. Um, so, anyways, when you practice magic, you start to develop a totally different tree of logic because you start with a very different assumption. Instead of the primary assumption being the universe is a cold, hard, random explosion of random particles that happen for no reason, and everything is just purely mechanical, and there's no intelligence or meaning behind any of it. It's all just a random collision of random particles that happen to just come together in certain ways. And consciousness is just an illusion, a byproduct of chemicals happening to come together in exactly the right way to give, you know, instead of that assumption, you can start with the assumption that the universe is consciousness, that everything is consciousness at its very fundamental core. When you start with that assumption, you build a very different tree of logic, a very different chain of understanding. And the gap between the two is very difficult to bridge without just talking at length about things that may or may not even really fully make sense. So one of the things that has changed for me as a practitioner of magic is that I've had to learn to use a very different way of thinking. And you kind of have to start from the beginning. and that can be difficult. You have to get very comfortable with the word maybe, or seems like, could be, appears as if. There's a lot, because there's really not a lot of certainty in all of this. Especially like if you're practicing magic and something occurs, a manifestation occurs as a result of that, there's always plenty of room for doubt. You can always examine it further and say, well, this just happened this way, and there's a rational explanation for this, and they just happen to come together. You can always come with a rational explanation to explain it away and sort of uh, remove the magic from it. Or you can see it as a manifestation of, you know, say you do a ritual to get a new job, a specific type of new job, and suddenly the next day or a day later, that thing manifests. It happens. The exact thing that you were trying to create happens to show up. And you can either say, well, that was going to happen anyway. It's just a coincidence. It's just random. Or you can say that I did a ritual and it actually worked. And there can always be sort of equal amounts of evidence to support both ways of looking at it. And that can create a bit of a cognitive dissonance. When you have two simultaneously existing beliefs that are directly opposed and yet somehow can seem to both possibly be true at the same time, that can create some pretty difficult experiences internally, because you're trying to figure out, well, what is the truth? I want to know exactly what is the truth. What is, there's that word is, not seems like or it could be. What is the truth? And as far as I can tell, there is no truth except for the fact that there is no truth. There is only perception. And which lines up with the idea that all is consciousness, right? So any change in consciousness can manifest a change in your circumstance. But change in consciousness is not just a matter of thinking really hard about something, like you might hear in some these more like new age sort of circles where they talk about manifestation, and you're like, you just think it into existence. It's not really about thinking, it's about the state of being. It's your consciousness. It's this fundamental baseline level. You could call it your vibration, right? But for most people, that never really changes very much, because it's kind of solidifies at a very young age. Around like 7 or 8 years old, you will have absorbed everything you experienced as a child. You've inherited all your parents' belief systems. This collection of emotions and thoughts and beliefs begins to create a sort of fundamental feeling, a sense, a state of consciousness. And that begins to solidify, and you build your life and your ego and your sense of identity on top of that foundation. And when you start to use things like magic, it's like vibrating that foundation. It's like you're trying to raise that foundational state of consciousness to a higher level. And so you start kind of poking at aspects of yourself that you don't even realize you have, because it's always been there as long as you can remember. It's a feeling that's been with you for so long that you don't even recognize it as anything. It's just normal. It's just what's there. It's just me. And when you start using things like ceremonial high magic and invoking the elements and these planetary forces and zodiacal forces and the Sephirotic forces and all this kind of stuff, you start altering that baseline vibration, so to speak. And so everything that's built up on top of that foundation starts to crumble. Only it doesn't just crumble, it's almost as if it's like alive, and it starts to fight back. There's a part of the subconscious that really, it doesn't want you to change on a fundamental level. Its job is to keep things the same. It's the same kind of thing that makes it so you don't need to relearn to walk every day. There's a certain amount of self-perpetuation that is necessary to exist as a human, but that same mechanism starts to work against you when you are perpetuating old coping mechanisms or defense mechanisms that were born of childhood trauma, or beliefs that were handed down, fear-based beliefs that are handed down to you from generations of your family. So as you begin to try to alter the foundation which that ego structure is built upon, um, things will start to happen. It's like the universe will kind of accidentally show its hand in its way, in what it does to try to perpetuate that baseline state of being. strange things start to manifest around you. Like it's almost like the more you start to feel good, the higher that sort of deeper sense of well-being and just peace becomes, the more it's like the world starts trying to drag you back down. Now, I've heard many people say that they're afraid to be too happy because that's when something bad happens. Well, there's actually a reason for that. That's not just like a flippant thing to say. It's because you start to feel really happy. That baseline starts to change, and the subconscious goes, no, this is what we're used to. This is how it's supposed to be. And suddenly, things in your reality beyond your control start to happen. Coincidences start to come up, but they're the bad kind of coincidences that seem to be trying to almost like scare you back into believing, back into your old state of being until, and sometimes things can be pretty jarring. So bad stuff starts happening all of a sudden, and so you become afraid, and you start kind of doubling down on your usual way of perceiving the world and interacting with things, your usual belief systems. And when that happens, you have that choice we talked about. You could say, it's just random, doesn't have anything to do with anything. Magic isn't real. There's no such thing. We don't have any real influence on the universe around us. It's all just work, 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 hard work, and discipline. And when things go right, it's because I made it happen. Go me. What a great job I did. Never considering the fact that every situation that you encounter requires a near infinite number of different things to come together in exactly the right way and exactly the right time beyond your control in order for your efforts to have the result that you hope it's going to have. And when things go your way, it's like, go me, good job. What a hardworking, disciplined person I am. Yes, I am something, aren't I? And then when things go badly, that's when we're like, oh, why, God, why did you do, Or you can just say it's all random. Or you can recognize, like, I started doing these rituals, I started to feel better, and then all of a sudden, the very thing I started to feel better about seemed to go wrong at that exact same time. So you kind of have a choice to make. Am I going to explore further down this rabbit hole of magic and see where it takes me, even though it's by definition is going into the unknown, which is scary, right? Or am I going to rationalize it all away, continue doing exactly what I've been doing, and write it off as just a random coincidence that doesn't mean anything? Um, so, so I guess long story short, one of the things that has changed is that I've learned to be much more comfortable with uncertainty, and to not always react immediately when things go wrong, and to observe the sort of fear and emotions that come up when things go wrong. Not to say that I'm like a master of it. I'm still working through my own stuff. I've gone a long way down this process, but there's still farther to go. Um, it's not a fast and easy thing. I mean, I guess for some people it could be. I think the process of initiation, uh, the harder your childhood was, the harder the process will be, because uh, the more sort of trauma energy you'll have to work through. But at the same time, it becomes more of an imperative to do so. The more sort of damaged your psychology really is. But anyways, so another thing that has changed is it's almost like the entire rule set of magic and really just my entire reality has changed. So the final grade in the outer order curriculum in the book I mentioned earlier is called the portal grade. It starts with neophyte, and then there's Zelator, which is the earth grade, and then there's Theoricus, which is the where you're invoking the air element. And then there's philosopher, or no, the next one is Practicus. You're invoking the element of water every day, and then Philosophus for fire, and then Portal, which is the spirit grade, which is sort of the invisible binding force. It's almost kind of sounds like the Force from Star Wars. That kind of that provides like the background foundation for the four elements to manifest themselves and become visible. It's like the primary material of existence is what spirit is kind of supposed to be. And I'm coming to find that maybe the reason they call it the portal grade, I don't know if this was a conscious choice or not, but for me it is a lot like stepping through some kind of a portal and ending up in a whole different type of reality. Even though it still seems to be like superimposed upon the reality you've always existed in, but suddenly it's like the rule set has changed. It's almost like the universe no longer works the same way for you as it does for everyone else. And nobody, it's like the rule set changed and nobody bothered to tell you about it. So you start to feel like maybe you're going insane. um, because for some reason now it's like your efforts no longer seem to have the same effect on your circumstances as they used to. Whereas most of the world is still, working hard and forcing their will onto the world. And when things go right, they're like, yay, I did that. Look how awesome I am. Um, but then when you try to make things happen through physical effort, as a person who has kind of graduated through this course, it seems to only lead you in circles. You end up running into these collections of synchronicities that sort of just stop you dead in your tracks or make progress so difficult that you make these itty bitty little bits of progress and then eventually it ends up not getting anywhere anyways. And you've come to find that the only way forward is to continue this process of dissolving these old thought patterns, these, the conditioned ego, the narrative ego. Um, so yeah, I mean, I'd say that's definitely something that's changed. It's like the whole rule set has changed. When you used to do magic before, pre-initiation, when you do magic the way a person might normally do it, a practitioner might do it, you tend to have a very dualistic perspective on it. I am a person using magic and affecting my external world. Uh, and then you do a spell, and the thing manifests, but it seems to be limited by old patterns. The new job is just like the job before it, only in a different form. The same problems keep coming up. You manifest money, but then the money goes away and you're right back where you started. You manifest a new partner or girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever, but they end up having the exact same patterns and habits as your last relationship. So, you're kind of, it's working. You're able to sort of manifest things, but there's a limitation to it. It's like all you're really doing is re-manifesting your own inner demons with a different face on, with a different mask. But when you go through the portal grade afterwards, it's almost like all those little inner demons, so to speak, take on their true form. Now, instead of the fear of lack manifesting as a shitty job that you never really wanted, but you go to because you feel like you have to, now it manifests as the actual experience of lack and not having money and maybe fearing that you're not going to have your needs met and you can it's manifesting directly. That inner demon, that trauma is now showing its true face, and there's nothing you can do about it other than face it and feel the emotional reactions you have to these circumstances that come up, and observe them until they dissolve, and you process that old undigested energy, that trauma energy. And then suddenly, the situation that seemed to be so concrete and would not yield to any of your efforts, you're just stuck. You can't seem to fix it. Then suddenly, that situation seems to just disappear. Suddenly, it takes care of itself. You didn't even have to really do anything. It's just almost as if by magic, right? Um, so yeah, uh, once you go through the full initiation course, at least for me, the old way of doing things just doesn't work anymore. And if you try to explain to somebody who is still sort of rooted in the old way of doing things, they're not going to get it. More likely than not, if you try to explain yourself, people will just smile and nod and agree with everything you say and then never talk to you again. Or 5 minutes later, they will say something that is in direct contradiction to a thing that they agreed to 5 minutes ago. So you realize they're not really listening. So it kind of makes you feel like you might be going a little bit nuts until eventually you do this long enough that you start to finally accept that what you're seeing is not a hallucination. It is not just a made up story in your head. Like these patterns are really happening. And even though nobody else seems to see it around you, you have to learn to be able to trust yourself, trust your own perception over your conditioning, the beliefs, the thing that you were told to believe before you were old enough to have a decision in it yourself. So yeah, definitely it makes you have to learn to trust yourself and think for yourself, even in the situations where people around you are actively trying to discourage you from doing so, because it threatens, having if you express the sort of worldview that I've been discussing here to somebody who really doesn't want to hear it, they're not just going to be like, okay, agree to disagree. They're going to get defensive. They get almost offended by it. It triggers, they see it almost, they process it as almost like an existential threat. And they start trying to feel like they need to tear you down, or they need to convince you that you're wrong, or they'll get angry, or they'll just hate you for it. It's really kind of bizarre. But, anyways, um, see what else was there. I mean, there's so it's changed literally almost everything about me. Um, Trying to think of anything else I wanted to kind of bring up. Yeah, so like I was saying earlier about when you're in the beginning stages of magic, you view it in a very dualistic sense. You feel like the those spirits and angels and demons and whatnot are external entities that you're summoning from some other dimension that have their own independent existence, and you send them to go do stuff for you. It can appear that way in the beginning, and I get why people would think that's what's happening because it looks that way. I mean, that's why we characterize these things in that way as spirits and angels and demons and what have you. But what's really happening, if you go far enough down this rabbit hole, you start to realize that there is no such thing as the external world. There is only consciousness, and this illusion that you are separate from your environment starts to fade away. You know, the more this sort of narrative ego identity starts to dissolve, the more you start to just kind of feel almost like you're just a giant bubble. You are a big space within which all things happen, and your body is like your primary viewing center or something like that. The reality is like the screen, and you are the projector. I guess is another way you could put it. And then when you start using magic and calling spirits and whatnot, you really just notice how when you do that, what tends to happen is that the blockages between you and the state of being you're trying to get to manifest whatever is what gets agitated. It comes right up to the surface so that you can look at it and view it and either dissolve it or make it shrink through your awareness, and then it comes back again later and you do it again. Or it just completely dominates you. You lose track of what you're trying to do. You think it's all real, and you have like this existential crisis that you eventually pull out of. Um, but yeah, once you go through an initiation process, it stops manifesting your old patterns in disguise and starts shoving them in your face, really. Um, um, and makes things tend to get worse before they get better. You know, in my experience, whenever I try to use magic to affect a specific thing, one of a few things happens. Either the thing happens right away, but then it's replaced. Like, say you're trying to remove an obnoxious person from your life. You just want them to go away. You're not trying to hurt them or do anything bad. You just want them to go away and leave your experience. So you do some kind of magic, maybe using Saturn to banish them or bind them from harming you. And all of a sudden, the next day, that person, they move away, or something happens, they get a different job. They just go away all of a sudden. But then they get replaced by somebody worse, and the problem gets worse. And now you have to confront a more amplified version of whatever that old person was causing in your life. And then eventually, that person disappears too. And then the problem's gone. Or you use magic to try to do something to remove an obnoxious influence in your life or try to bring something in, and then that problem, it just gets worse, it just gets bigger. You know, you want your neighbors to stop being so noisy, so you use some magic to try to make that happen, but all of a sudden they get 10 times louder for like the next 2 or 3 weeks, and they're just driving you crazy, and then all of a sudden they're gone. That tends to be how magic tends to manifest for me. Or if I use any of the more the big magic, as I would call it, like the Assumption of God forms rituals or any kind of Enochian magic, especially Enochian. Good God, don't mess with Enochian. I wouldn't recommend it until you've gotten well down the path of an adept, because it will beat you over the head with that sort of those blockages that manifest. Like Enochian's sort of like the highest voltage of magic you can access, as far as I'm concerned, and it is very direct, and it can be very brutal in the way that it forces you to confront things. Um, Whenever I use those kinds of magic, it tends to really agitate the remaining ego structure, those old emotions and wounds that you haven't healed yet. They tend to get very agitated. You feel almost like there's like an electricity that in your body that feels like an ungrounded wire. It can be very uncomfortable, can mess with your sleep. You start having nightmares, weird stuff starts going wrong all in your environment for weeks, maybe even months at a time when you use the bigger stuff like that. So I would recommend leaving that till later if you're not, if you haven't already gone through a process like this and done a considerable amount of work. Um, I think I'm going to stop there. Hopefully, I think the few of you who have made it to this point in the video, thank you for watching. Check out my website in the description below. You can book readings. There's the meanings of all the tarot cards and planets and signs are there, as well as a gematria lookup tool that I created if you're into gematria. But anyways, thanks for watching and take care.